Wonderful. Thank you so much. So welcome to West End Synagogue's fourth part of the four-part educational series on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict presented by esteemed Rabbi Maurice Harris, a Reconstructionist rabbi, and the Israel Affairs specialist at Reconstructing Judaism. This program is presented by West End Synagogue, co-sponsored by its Israel Connections Committee. So thank you to those on Israel Connections, and its Adult Education Committee. So thank you to those as well. This has been a four-part series presented on 4 consecutive Tuesdays, and this is the last. But each one is a sort of an independent period of time, and you're welcome to attend only this one, even if you've not seen the previous ones. They will be sufficient unto themselves. We also welcome visitors from many other congregations. I've seen people from SAJ, from Congregation Beit Am Shalom, among others, so welcome. Let me introduce you all to Rabbi Maurice Harris. I think we can spotlight him on the screens for you all. Someone knows how to do that. There we go. Beautiful. So a short bio: he's the child of a Moroccan-Israeli Jewish mother and an Ashkenazi Midwestern American Jewish father who spent most of his childhood summers among his family in working-class Moroccan neighborhoods of Tel Aviv. In 2003, Maurice received rabbinic ordination from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, after which he served as associate rabbi at Temple Beth Israel in Eugene, Oregon until 2011. For the past 7.5 years, Rabbi Maurice has worked as Associate Director for Thriving Communities and as Israel Affairs Specialist at Reconstructing Judaism, and he is also the author of several books. Just for those of you who are new to this course, it has been a 4-part comprehensive overview of the major components of the Palestinian conflict, historically, beginning really at the earliest stages and heading up to near where we are now, which is, I think, where we will begin tonight. This is admittedly a challenging subject. To do this, Rabbi Harris has used what he calls a dual narrative approach, in which he alternates between classical Jewish Zionist point of view or narrative and a classical Palestinian narrative that often conflicts or presents a different side of the story. Presenting these perspectives side by side, the course describes and attempts to humanize and understand both in a way that honors the depth, humanity, and complexity of the people involved in the conflict. Let me flip my page and conclude in just a second. Although the course presents both narratives, Rabbi Harris makes clear that he approaches the subject from his own progressive Zionist perspective, but urges people to seek out and explore other points of view as well. As a reminder, the views and analysis presented are entirely those of Rabbi Harris. They do not speak in any official way for West End Synagogue or Reconstructing Judaism as an organization. But I will say that they are very in-depth and important views that I think they're worthy of all of us to understand and grapple with. The lecture should take, we think, about an hour and a quarter or so. And to keep things flowing smoothly, we will hold our questions to the end, and we ask that they be written in the chat. So please save your questions if possible. Now, I don't know if you can all see my name at the top of the chat because I'm speaking. It's usually at the top. I would suggest that you send the questions directly to me. That gives me the best opportunity to see them and collect them together and perhaps combine them with another question or offer them to the rabbi. So I ask you to save your questions to the end. We're going to close the chat so that we can go smoothly, and we'll open it again 10 minutes or so before the end. So thank you all. Let's begin, and we appreciate everyone being respectful and considerate of all of the views presented by not only by Rabbi Harris, but by those who offer questions.
Good evening. I am already feeling the sense of having gone with you on a fairly long journey with a lot of moments of rapid pivots, especially toggling back and forth between these two narratives. And I'd like to have us dive in. I'm going to share my screen. And I welcome you to session 4 of this series. I hope that my sound is coming through good, and if it doesn't, someone should, one of the co-hosts, just open up your mic and let me know. But I think we're good. I want to acknowledge that this is a vast subject, and we're covering a lot of ground together. And there are some things that I am not covering in this series simply for lack of time and the ability to do it in a dual narrative approach. So I want to name some of those things, and if they're of interest to you in the Q&A, feel free to bring them up then. So some things I am not covering in this course, the rise and popularization of the BDS movement in pro-Palestinian political movements, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. I don't have anything on that in this course. The specifics from the Hamas attacks of October 7th, all the way up to the present moment, and the current war, that's not really a subject that I'm covering in the course, although plenty of what we're covering is relevant to it. In the last few years, there's been controversy over competing definitions of anti-Semitism, and specifically how to evaluate anti-Israel or speech that is critical of Israel in light of how you define anti-Semitism. Not covering that in this course. There has been a kind of war of words over the use of the word apartheid in reference to Israel. Also not something I have a specific subunit on. Finally, this one might surprise some of you, but there's a growing field of discourse about global warming, about climate change. Israel is a country and the Gaza Strip is a territory that are right on the coast and that are at risk of major change if coastlines should actually change their shape in the years to come. And a lot of folks who study the conflict are worried about that and are trying to see if there's a way to get ahead of that problem. So now that I've said things that aren't covered, let me say what we'll be doing. We'll be trying to cover the two narratives takes on the last 30 years. And we'll also take a little time to look at some of the different proposals for resolving the conflict that are current in the mix of diplomatic, popular, and academic discussions. So this is part 4, the struggles and collapse of Oslo, the rise of radicals, reactionaries, and cosmic warriors, and options for the future. So from the autumn of 1993 until the autumn of 1995, most Israelis were caught up in the optimism of the Oslo Agreement's early successes. We spent a fair amount of time last session looking at that. There was fierce opposition to the Oslo process from the Israeli right, most fervently from the Messianic religious settler movement, which believed that God would punish the Jews if they were to give up control over any of the West Bank lands that were once part of biblical Israel. There was also intense opposition from the more secular Likud party led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who argued that the labor-led center-left government of Yitzhak Rabin was leading the country into a security disaster, and who, according to his critics, fanned the flames of intense hatred of Rabin during many of his public speeches. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and a number of smaller Palestinian revolutionary groups also condemned the Oslo process and condemned Yasser Arafat's Fatah party as sellouts to Israel, and they rallied their supporters to take action to stop or disrupt the process. But in large measure, certainly beyond anything that had happened in years past, there was also tremendous enthusiasm and hope in the air for Israelis and at the same time for Palestinians, even though there was a lot of skepticism on their part. Palestinians would need to actually see the Israelis withdraw from meaningful blocks of occupied territory, halt settlement building, share water equitably, and so on, to believe that the agreement would turn into reality. A lot of Palestinians also strongly demanded that Arafat negotiate for hard, tangible gains for Palestinian refugees and their long lost homes, shops, and farms. For their part, Israelis feared that letting Arafat's PLO set up a government within the occupied territories under a flag of peace was going to turn out to be Israel's great Trojan horse mistake. Palestinians feared that Arafat's love of international attention and adulation would lead him to give away far too much and sell out his people into a humiliating agreement. So you can see how there were these kind of mirroring types of skepticism and worry happening in both communities roughly 1993 through 95. For the first couple of years after the White House lawn handshake, the progress that both sides made implementing the agreement was rewarded, financially rewarded, diplomatically, symbolically. And we looked at some of that last time, but you can see it in another way here in these images on screen. The partial newspaper front page, if you look below the top half of the paper and look sort of down and on the left, it's not so easy to see, but you can see the front page showing Palestinians celebrating and waving their no longer illegal flag. And the two Israeli postage stamps that you see are small but poignant examples of how the new peace agreements, and I say agreements in the plural, because right on the heels of Oslo came peace with Jordan, how those agreements opened up the floodgates of many official public gestures of goodwill and hope. And then it fell apart, in no small measure because of this one young man's assassination of Israel's prime minister. History will probably record that Yigal Amir, the 27-year-old Jewish law student who murdered Yitzhak Rabin, carried out one of the most politically successful assassinations in modern history. Nearly 30 years since that tragic November night, Amir, who remains incarcerated and has gotten to have conjugal visits and has gotten to vote in every single Israeli election since, he has also gotten to witness what he had so desperately hoped for: the collapse of Oslo, the utter ruin of Yitzhak Rabin's Labor Party, the expansion of settlements, and the growth and political rise to power of far-right religious parties that share his views, now forming part of the current coalition government of Israel. He kind of got just about everything he wanted. And while Amir did not cause the Oslo process to unravel all by himself, his murder of Rabin did open a door of opportunity for Palestinians and Israelis opposed to the peace deal to exploit the new uncertainties of the moment. That is exactly what they did. But before we go on, I just want to offer a note of warning that there are some violent images in the rest of the presentation. You know, people should do what they need to do if that is difficult. So let's start with an Israeli narrative. In the mid-1990s, Hamas pursued a strategy of ruining the peace process by targeting Israeli buses, cafes, and open markets with bombings often carried out by suicide bombers. As you can see, bus bombings alone claimed a large number of Israeli lives. So try to put yourself in the shoes of ordinary Israelis during this time. In 1995, Israel's population was roughly 5.5 million people. Think of a North American urban metro area with something approximating that population size. Actually, it's easy for me. That's roughly the size of the Philadelphia metro area. So imagine that in one given year, sorry about that. Imagine that in one given year, there are 5 separate bus bombings in that metro area in which the bus explodes. There are bodies everywhere, and scores of people have been wounded and many killed. If that were to happen in Philly, if in the course of one year, 5 public buses blew up and 40 people were killed and several hundred injured, and parents were afraid to send their kids to school, and the authorities seemed to be unable to do anything to stop it. And then, if somehow you could imagine people in Philly going on TV and seeing live footage of people from a neighboring ethnic community whose radicals perpetrated these acts, seeing TV footage of them celebrating and shooting off fireworks and handing out candy and valorizing these suicide bombers as martyrs. It wouldn't matter if it was just a handful of the people in that group. That's all it would take, would be a handful to sear those images into one's mind and heart. Let's just say, I can't even imagine what would happen to the leaders of such a city, of my city. They would be thrown out of office and a massive emergency would be declared, and average citizens would not bat an eyelash at extreme heavy-handed measures being taken to shut it all down. Now, imagine that happening several years in a row, which is what happened in Israel, with center-left Israeli leaders urging their own public to stay the course, to trust the peace process and wait for a day when the radical extremists on the other side will finally have lost, and reminding everyone that this is a small fringe of people on the other side who are celebrating this and so forth. It would be very difficult to maintain some kind of public support for staying in this peace process and not simply turning to all-out war. Now, of course, as an outsider watching all of this happen, one can say, well, this is exactly what Hamas wanted. They wanted to turn the entire Israeli Jewish population against the peace process in the mid-1990s and lead them to violent overreactions. So therefore, it was in the interest of Israelis to refuse to take the bait. Don't give Hamas what they want. And an outside observer saying that would be correct. But when you are living in the middle of the experience, such as Israelis were, you cannot make yourself into that detached outsider who sees how you are being played by Hamas. You're in it, and your visceral reactions are overwhelming. So this is how a lot of Israelis look at these years shortly after the Oslo Agreement had its early success, as years in which suddenly it wasn't safe to go anywhere. And suddenly, the people who they were looking to be responsible for their safety did not seem capable of providing them with safety. So this material is hard. Let's pause for a breath and want to ask if folks can make sure you're muted. That also helps. We'll just take a little breath because we are going to, as we do in this course, we're going to now flip the script and take a look at a Palestinian narrative. So, as had been Israeli policy for quite some time, when there would be terror attacks in Israel, Israeli military reprisals would be swift and severe and would kill much larger numbers of Palestinians, including civilians, than the terrorist attacks against Israelis. The Israelis during this period employed targeted assassinations, sometimes using missile strikes that would kill many civilians as collateral damage. Despite efforts to send warnings via cell phones or leaflets to people in the nearby vicinity, Israelis engaged in raids on suspects' homes and neighborhoods, and they made heavy use of their air force. They sometimes responded to terrorist attacks by announcing new settlement expansion and land expropriation in the West Bank as forms of collective punishment against the Palestinians. The Israeli army tightened its restrictions of movement throughout all the parts of the occupied territories that it still controlled, and it began implementing a practice of demolishing the homes of the families and relatives of suspected terrorists. Remember, one of the main commitments Israel made when it entered the Oslo Agreement was to dial down its expansion of land grabs and new building projects in the occupied territories. Palestinians were supposed to see their lives become less and less controlled by the Israeli military over time. That was a key for the whole process to be able to succeed. Instead, the Israeli vice grip tightened and the occupation worsened. The mid to late 1990s saw a vicious cycle of violence, driven largely by Palestinian extremist groups like Hamas and by the Israeli government's decision to retaliate with overwhelming force and inflict greater destruction than whatever had just been inflicted upon Israelis. There are a lot of people who object to using the terminology of a cycle of violence to describe these patterns in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in part because often the idea of a cycle of violence is understood as happening in a context in which both parties have relatively equal or similar kinds of power. And of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very asymmetrical in terms of sheer military power and in terms of one party's degree of control over the other party's lives. But I think it's accurate to describe the particular cycle of back and forth violence that took place in the mid to late 90s between the suicide bombers of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Israel's political and military leaders. Even despite the power asymmetry, when I think of a cycle of violence, I think of the cycle itself having a kind of gravitational pull, having a force of its own that is very difficult to resist. And that cycle was poison to the progress of Oslo. You can see on this slide that we've come back to the metaphor I've turned to several times throughout this course, in which I have suggested that Palestinians tend to view the conflict from a ground level view of things, and Israelis have tended to view it from a bird's eye view. Or to say it differently, that the Zionist narrative has tended to take a bird's eye or global view of the conflict in its effort to solve problems of survival for the Jewish people, whereas the Palestinian narrative has been focused on tangible changes, losses, and defeats that have happened on the ground and in the lives of everyday people and families. I still think that that is generally a useful metaphor. But during this period, both Israelis and Palestinians were sucked by this particular cycle of violence into viewing the conflict intensely from a ground level view. You have to keep in mind, for Israelis in the mid-1990s, it had been a long time since any Arab guerrilla or militant forces had succeeded in killing large numbers of Israelis in the heart of where they live, play, work, and go to school. And it had been a very long time since Israelis had the lived experience of wondering whether they could actually go on with their daily lives with this level of fear, uncertainty, and destruction literally blowing up in their midst. Palestinians, by contrast, were used to heavy Israeli military intrusion in their daily lives, including normalized little daily acts of humiliation and dominance in their frequent interactions with Israeli soldiers at hundreds of checkpoints, and in the efforts of some of them to go to jobs in Israel or in the settlements. What Palestinians were hoping for with Oslo was to see a reduction in those daily patterns. As we looked at last session, initially that happened. But once Israel started its military reprisals for these terrorist attacks, things got even worse for Palestinians. Bombs rained down on crowded and densely populated neighborhoods. Home demolitions shattered extended families who had some connection with a terrorist. Israeli raids and mass arrests, sometimes including minors, tightened the noose of the occupation and made their daily lives more intolerable. At the lowest point of all of this, both groups were largely so stuck in the worst of a ground level view that it would have required a superhuman effort to be able to rise above it and see that they were both playing into the hands of the political and ideological minority groups in their respective societies who were out to sabotage the peace process from reaching a final two-state permanent reality. Israelis and Palestinians who could see what was happening tried during these years to reframe the conflict in terms of saying that it had morphed into a contest between supporters of peace and enemies of peace. But unfortunately, it was just too easy and too human for each new outrage from one side or the other to make the people who would say such things appear weak and naive. And yet, despite these challenges, there was still incremental progress being made in implementing the Oslo Agreement through the rest of the 90s and approaching the year 2000. US President Bill Clinton feverishly tried in his last year in office to bridge the remaining gaps and secure a final status agreement between then Israeli Prime Minister and Labor Party leader Ehud Barak and Palestinian President Yasser Arafat. Let's take a look at why that didn't work and how things unraveled further in its aftermath. Clinton had hoped that he would be able to put a capstone on his presidential legacy by achieving a final status agreement that would result in the announcement of the new state of Palestine taking its place alongside the state of Israel. As he was attempting to negotiate with both teams, the same toxic cycle of terrorist attacks against Israelis and massive Israeli reprisals continued. Another threat to the success of reaching a final status agreement came from the Israeli Prime Minister's right, this time in the person of Likud leader Ariel Sharon, who created a public spectacle by asserting his religious right to visit the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, an act that would require violating the Islamic religious protocols involved in entering sacred Islamic space. Now, Sharon was not religious at all, and he knew that doing this would provoke angry feelings throughout the Islamic world and even risk igniting spontaneous waves of violence, but he saw political opportunity and he did it anyway. Even so, as all this was going on, talks at Camp David and then later at the Egyptian resort of Taba continued right up until the beginning of the George W. Bush administration. There have been many, many books written by people who were, quote, in the room during these negotiations. And each account offers a different take on why the negotiations in the year 2000 failed and who is most to blame. This is another one of the places where the two narratives differ dramatically. Israelis claim that Prime Minister Barak bent over backwards and offered the Palestinians a contiguous state on 95% of the territory of the West Bank and Gaza, along with territorial land swaps to make up for some of the lands that Israel would claim in the West Bank. They also say that Barak made symbolic concessions regarding the sharing of Jerusalem as a potential capital for both states, and that he was generous in arrangements involving the Temple Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque complex. As you can imagine, Palestinian accounts differ dramatically. Palestinian accounts dispute that any concrete Israeli proposals were seriously put on the table by Barak. And they recall having their arms enormously twisted by both the Americans and the Israelis, and that they were heavily being pushed by Clinton's team because of his imminent departure from office and because George W. Bush had indicated publicly that he planned to pull American diplomatic efforts away from resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict once he came into office. As you can see on your screen, the talks failed to reach a final agreement on these 5 key issues: borders, arrangements regarding Jerusalem and the holy sites, a plan for some kind of compromise regarding Palestinian refugees and the right of return, security arrangements, and the status of the settlements. Now, looking at that list, you might say cynically, well, Maurice, isn't that just about everything? Are you saying they couldn't agree on any of the key things? But no, that's not the case here. Failing to reach agreement on these issues was actually a matter of being close to the finish line on most of them, and maybe just needing a little bit more work to get there. Probably the single most contentious of these issues, the one that they were the furthest apart of, was Palestinian refugees and the right of return. In any event, these talks ended without a final agreement reached. George W. Bush came into office and he followed through on his pledge to pause intensive American diplomacy on this issue. And then what became known as the Second Intifada broke out. This time, Palestinian protests, again, primarily nonviolent, coincided with different extremist groups launching new waves of terrorist attacks inside Israel and within the settlements. And as before, Israeli military reprisals killed large numbers of Palestinian civilians and intensified distrust and hatred on the Palestinian side. Now, there are a lot of specific events that I could cover in depth and in detail that have taken place over the 24 years since the start of the Second Intifada, or 23 years, I should say. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in order to save time for Q&A, and also because some of the dynamics have basically recurred. So I feel that if you've been with me this far along the ride in this class, you already have a sense of what this drama tends to look like as it erupts again and again. So I am going to mention in sort of quick and dirty fashion some names and events just to kind of bring a lot of our brains up to speed without going in depth into analyzing a lot of the details. So these include the election of Ariel Sharon to be prime minister in 2001, the Gaza disengagement by Israel, in which Israelis removed their settlements and withdrew their military forces from Gaza in the year 2005. The rise to power of Ariel Sharon's top lieutenant, Ehud Olmert, who would succeed him as prime minister in 2006. During this time span, Yasser Arafat died, possibly by poisoning, nobody's really sure, in 2004. And Mahmoud Abbas became the president of the Palestinian Authority. In 2006, after Palestinian parliamentary elections that resulted in Hamas winning the largest block of seats and leading a new majority coalition in the Palestinian legislature, a standoff between Abbas's Fatah party and Hamas led to a civil war between Hamas and Fatah. Abbas had insisted that if Hamas wanted to be a part of the government, then they had to disband their militia and respect the constitutional chain of command in the Palestinian Authority that flowed from the president to the Palestinian police, their armed forces. In other words, Hamas had to choose between being an independent guerrilla group with its own army or being a political party. Hamas refused that demand, and then Abbas booted them out of the government. And then Fatah and Hamas fighters opened fire on each other in Gaza and the West Bank. Hamas defeated Fatah in Gaza and seized the territory, making it into a Hamas-governed statelet, and that is where things stand to this day. There were other major events during this time as well, including the Israeli withdrawal from a military buffer zone that it had set up in southern Lebanon that took place in the year 2000. And 6 years later, the outbreak of a new round of warfare between Israel and Hezbollah, the Islamist militant group that came to take control of southern Lebanon. There was the election of Barack Obama and an American government hoping to reignite the Oslo process in 2008, followed by the return to power of Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel in 2009, and his determined effort to dismantle the Oslo process and prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. The Arab Spring erupted in 2011 and 12, and it looked like it might usher in a wave of democratic reforms across Sunni Arab states. At the same time, the epic humanitarian catastrophe of the Syrian civil war that began in 2011 and still goes on today also has played a role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're marching through recent years on the timeline quickly now. The rise of xenophobic nationalism and illiberal autocratic demagogues in the United Kingdom, the US, Brazil, Hungary, and elsewhere, along with a growing move towards autocracy in China and a solidifying of Putin's autocratic rule in Russia, shook some of the foundations of international law that the Oslo process or any future hope to revive it would need to rest upon. But there was also a counterforce to that wave of xenophobic nationalism that played out over the last decade, and it has also played a role, in some cases flipping power back to small d democratic rule in places like the US, Brazil, Poland, and successfully staving off challenges by far-right political parties in Germany, France, Canada, and elsewhere. In Israel, we saw this counterforce self-organize against the growing autocratic rule by Netanyahu in the massive pro-democracy demonstrations that dominated Israel for almost all of the year 2023, right up until October 7th. All of these events, and please don't worry if you were not able to keep track of all of them or even half of them, but all of these events have had their impacts on the conflict and on the prospects for leading to a resolution of the conflict through some kind of mutually agreed and internationally recognized and supported compromise. So in the next several slides, I'm going to focus on some of the larger patterns that have characterized these past 2 decades according to each of these two narratives, and during which there has not, during a period during which there has not really been meaningful progress on the diplomatic front. So now we're going into the Palestinian narrative. So buckle in. I know I find these next several slides hard, and then we'll flip. We'll go to a Zionist narrative, and then we'll actually come out the other side, looking at some of the um, uh, current proposals that are getting a lot of traction in diplomatic circles and among academics, and I'm talking really in the past few years. So that's where we're going. Okay, little bit depressing. Each of the two narratives starts with a slide that begins with the words, things that have gotten worse for, and fill in the blank with one group or the other. So here's things that have gotten worse for Palestinians since the year 2000. First and foremost is the entrenchment of the experience of living under occupation in the West Bank and under blockade in Gaza. And this takes a lot of different forms. So one of them, which we've already talked about a fair amount, has been the dramatic expansion of settlements. And when I use that term now, I'm referring to settlements that have been authorized by the Israeli government and outposts, which are settlements on the ground that the Israeli government has not authorized. In other words, they're illegal even according to Israeli law. And there has been a real mushrooming of the number of people who have moved into these settlements in the West Bank. I've been trying to find a graph that goes all the way up to 2023, because if you actually extend this graph to 2023, you will get to you'll get up to the number 750,000. Just to give you an idea of how steep that curve is. And if you look right around 1993, if you can find it on the chart, you'll see there were a little over 100,000 settlers. So that's at the moment that the Israeli government enters into the first Oslo Agreement. By 1995, the Israeli government has signed on to what's called Oslo II. It was a second stage and a more detailed expansion of the Oslo Agreement. And in Oslo II, the Israeli government makes a commitment to stop changing what the West Bank is like on the ground, and to stop changing what Gaza is like. In other words, they make a commitment to leave the status quo in terms of settlements in place. And you can see that they just wouldn't do it, despite all kinds of pushback from various American administrations, and obviously from the Palestinians as well. So this just keeps getting worse for Palestinians. In addition, one of the ways that Israel responded to the enormous wave of terrorism by Palestinian extremist groups was building the security wall and security fence, which was very controversial. If you look at this picture, I want to point out the thing that is really the most controversial about it. It's not so much that the Israelis chose to build a wall or a fence. In fact, a Palestinian friend of mine who I've known for about 20 years, who lives in Bethlehem, and who is a secular Muslim Palestinian, over tea, told me, and this was around 2004 or 2005, he said, I don't really care if you guys build a wall in your yard. Like, if you build a wall on your side of the border, the green line, because we have crazies who've been causing harm in your country. I don't have a problem with that. But I do have a problem with you building the wall according to the path that the red line in this map takes. And that's what Israel has done. They used the building of the wall as an opportunity to also do land grabs and to go deep into the West Bank and to make decisions that were supposed to be ultimately negotiated. So that is a thing that Palestinians notice dramatically in the course of all of this. You can see in this image sort of a classic example of what a settlement in the West Bank looks like. The Israelis tend to take the high ground in the rolling hills of the West Bank, and if that land, is vacant, then it's even easier. But sometimes they've expropriated land and offered a military rationale for it. And then what ends up happening is these sort of beautiful new apartments with these Spanish tile roofs get built, and they get built physically looking down upon these older, more established Palestinian villages. And then there are the issues involving water, with 87% of the water table under the West Bank being used for Israeli settlements, and the other 13% being left for the Palestinians. And there are about 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank. In Israel proper, the growth of settlements is either sort of ignored by most of the rest of the population or even sort of commemorated positively through things like this postage stamp issue. And here's another, a more up-to-date chart that also shows that incredibly steep curve, especially once you get from 1993 to the present moment. So that's one way in which the occupation has gotten worse for Palestinians. Another is in terms of the quality of daily life. So if you're a Palestinian and you live in the West Bank and you're trying to get from point A to point B might be inside Israel. Maybe you have a construction job inside Israel proper, and you have a clean record and you have a permit from the Israeli government. Or maybe you live in Ramallah and you are trying to travel about 25 kilometers to visit relatives in another town in the West Bank. That should take you maybe 15 to 20 minutes to drive. The problem is that you are likely to end up having to spend the better part of half a day or more getting from one place to another that should take less than an hour. And there's an unpredictability to this experience. It might be that checkpoints pop up that aren't there some of the time, and then there are these other ones that are more fortified. And this is an image of a recent map of all of the checkpoints that were dotting various roads and byways throughout the West Bank on a given day. So for Palestinians, the idea of freedom of movement is a really, really huge thing. And it's something that making changes in Palestinian freedom of movement would be a tangible difference maker. Again, if you've ever had an opportunity to actually go on foot through one of these checkpoints during a busy time, and my wife and I have, it is very much an experience like what you're seeing in these pictures. It's just extremely dysfunctional in terms of being able to run a business, be in touch with family, in some cases run an errand. It makes life extremely unpredictable. It also creates one of the only regular interfaces that a lot of younger Palestinians have with any Israelis at all. So imagine growing up and your only interactions with Israelis are the people who are staffing the checkpoints. And imagine that a lot of the people staffing the checkpoints are really, really young soldiers people 18 to 22. When I was 18 to 22, I was not at my peak in terms of making my very, very best decisions all the time. So there are a lot of people, including inside Israel's security establishment, who have expressed for years the worry that this is all kind of a setup for clashes and for people to get hot and angry at each other, and then for things to go sideways. Okay, we're still in the Palestinian narrative here about what the last 20 or so years has been like living under occupation. And one of the experiences that Palestinians struggle with very much is that there are these two different legal systems that are operating in the West Bank. So people who live in Israel proper, whether they're Jewish or Arab, whatever their ethnicity, they are living under Israeli civil law. Palestinians who are living in the West Bank, even if they live in one of those small areas that is also partly under the control of the Palestinian Authority, um, they are subject to Israeli military law. And this works very, very differently. So if you're arrested in the West Bank by the Israeli army, you do not have the same sort of Bill of Rights that you would have if you were arrested by the police in Israel. You're going to face a military tribunal. You're going to be ruled upon in a way that is not subject to appeal. You will be provided an attorney, but there's not that much the attorney can do. The military does not have to provide a charge before. I think they have to within a week. I'll find out exactly, but they have quite a nice little span where they don't have to provide a charge. Hundreds and hundreds of minors every year are detained for long periods of time. And then at the end of it, the tribunal issues its decision, and then you may have a record. And again, there's like sort of no way to appeal this or to do anything about it. So there are these two completely different legal systems. The other thing that's important to know is the way that the Israeli government justifies using a system of military law in the West Bank is that they make the argument to the United Nations and to sort of the world of international law. They make the argument that this is a military occupation. So for people who say don't use the word occupation, you can accurately respond by saying, well, actually, the state of Israel uses that term to justify why it is using military law instead of civil law in its dealings with Palestinians in the West Bank. Now, it is illegal under international law for an occupying army to move members of its home country citizens into that territory or to build permanent housing structures there. So when Israel is arguing in front of the international legal community that they have a right to build settlements, they actually argue this the other direction. And they claim that this is all disputed territory subject to final negotiation. The Israeli Supreme Court itself has slammed this, trying to have it both ways, and has tried to push the Israeli government to get consistent. But these are just important things to understand, and they're very well known in Palestinian society. If you want the Palestinian narrative, this is a big part of it. And in addition to this, there are these two separate road systems that Israel has set up. The roads that connect the settlements to each other and back to Israel proper are only available to cars with yellow license plates. Those are Israeli cars. And there's a separate set of roads that are accessible to the green and white plates, the plates for Palestinians in the West Bank. And then there's a whole series of roads that are off limits or are only open at limited hours of the day to Palestinians. If you're wondering what has led some folks in the Palestinian narrative to make the apartheid accusation, this is a lot of what it's about. I'm not saying they're right or they're wrong. I'm presenting to you Palestinian narrative and part of where that argument is coming from. Okay, what else has gotten worse for Palestinians during this stretch? Obviously, a tremendous amount of civilian casualties and death. And we're talking about before the current war. We're just talking about the patterns of Israeli military reprisals in response to terrorist attacks. Um, by and large, the casualty count has been roughly 9 or 10 Palestinian civilians for every Israeli civilian. That's sort of been a ratio that's kind of held over the past 2.5 decades. I'm just going to, these are testimonies that were presented by 2 Gazan Palestinians after Israeli reprisals. I'll just leave this on the screen for a moment. I'm going to skip past this image to save some time. The Palestinian narrative during this time is heavy. Dispossession is another theme. The loss of um, olive groves, of pasture lands, of farmlands, and of homes has happened through all these different ways. It's partly that if there's a new settlement, then there needs to be sewage lines and there need to be bypass roads that the settlers can use to be safe. And so all of that then becomes the eminent domain argument for then taking more and more private Palestinian owned land. And the policy of home demolitions that I mentioned earlier a few years ago reached its peak. And as you can imagine, this is the kind of thing that a family or a child will never forget. Okay, you might want to stretch your shoulders and your neck because this is a moment of whiplash. We're going to talk about things that have gotten worse for Israelis since the year 2000, and then we'll come in for a landing. So one of the things that's gotten a lot worse for Israelis in the last 20 to 25 years is an enormous proliferation of rockets in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iran. And I want to unpack a little bit of what this is all about and what it means for Israelis. As I mentioned briefly earlier, there was an outbreak of war between Israel and Hezbollah, the non-state actor that controls southern Lebanon. Hezbollah is a Shiite militant group that embraces a radical and extremist strand of Islamist political religious belief. Their ideology is actually an ideology that could only have come to exist within the past 70 years or so. It's a blend of very radical and unorthodox interpretations of Islamic texts fused with a variety of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And after the fighting ended between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006, the United Nations secured an agreement and passed a binding resolution that spelled out the terms of the cessation of hostilities. As a matter of international law, one of the things that Hezbollah was forced to agree to, according to that resolution, was to not have any rockets. They now have somewhere between 130 and 150,000 of them. And these are not little rubber band projectiles. These are increasingly sophisticated missiles. And Hezbollah has its own army, and they have had somewhere between 20 and 30,000 fighters do active duty supporting the government of Assad in Syria in the civil war there. One of the reasons that their leaders have stated that they want their soldiers fighting there is because they want their soldiers to be thoroughly practiced in difficult army to army warfare for the day when they fight Israel. So they have an uncompromising, sort of divinely driven ideology fused with access to a tremendous number of rockets. And the big worry amongst rank and file Israelis is what if there's been access to the former chemical weapons stockpile that Assad once had? Almost all of that stockpile was destroyed, but there's worry that not quite all of it was. Similarly, Iran has very sophisticated rockets and also has an extremist religious group of ideologues who are in charge of their country. So these are things that keep Israelis up at night. This is actually a little bit old, and probably the red circle should be bigger than it is on this map, but it shows, at least as of 7 or 8 years ago, the overall rocket range of Hamas's rockets. This shows the rocket range of the arsenal that Hezbollah has stockpiled. And there is also this, a lot of times folks who care a lot about Israelis and Israel's security are like, well, thank God for the Iron Dome. And for sure, thank God for the Iron Dome. However, it costs about $100,000 to intercept a single rocket using the Iron Dome. The leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran know that it is not financially sustainable for Israel to sort of rely on the idea that however many rockets you want to fire, we're going to knock them all out of the sky. There's not that kind of unlimited amount of money that would make that possible. Not unless the cost were to come down dramatically with improvement in the counter rocket technology. These are things Israelis talk about at the kitchen table all the time. So in terms of the Zionist narrative today, the Israeli narrative today, what keeps Israelis up at night? A lot of it is this stuff. And with particular attention to weapons of mass destruction, to worries among Israelis about the possibility of the eventual use of chemical or biological weapons by one of these non-state actors or by Iran. And I want to say something about this because some people who really don't like hearing the Zionist narrative will say, you're making too much out of that. I'm just presenting a narrative here. But for Israelis living in the lives of a Zionist narrative, they don't feel like they're making too much out of it. For them, this anxiety really started becoming intense around the time of the Gulf War of 1990 and 91, when Saddam Hussein threatened to attack Israelis with chemical and biological weapons. And of course, as it turned out, he didn't do that or wasn't able to do that. We all know the story as it plays out from there in terms of Iraq and the United States and 9/11 and the war after that. But during 1990 and 91, as Saddam Hussein was firing rockets that were hitting Tel Aviv, Israelis were terrified and children were traumatized. The government distributed gas masks to the entire country. And in the immediate aftermath of that experience, the government provided funding to help people build sealed rooms. Israelis are basically a society of people kind of waiting for the day that they are going to be attacked with chemical or biological weapons. And the reason there's a picture of Zyklon B gas in the lower left-hand corner of your screen is because this is something any people would be fearful about. But in the Israeli imagination, especially older Israelis who remember the Nazi Holocaust, gassing Jews, using chemical weapons to target Jews is chilling and traumatizing in a very particular way. And a lot of people who aren't so sympathetic to Israeli fears don't know this or haven't been reminded of it. So it's important to understand. In terms of the Assad regime, again, during what was probably a stunning achievement of diplomacy during the Obama administration, Obama was able to get Putin at the time to agree to work with him to successfully catalog, take away, and destroy probably 90 to 95% of Assad's chemical weapons arsenal. And they did it without firing a shot. And that was a tremendous achievement. But we don't know if they got all of it. And the Assad regime has already used chemical weapons 216 times against civilians. What does that mean for Israelis? For Israelis, what it means is that they've already seen their neighbor next door include one extreme actor who was willing to do this to other people who are his own citizens. And what that leaves Israelis feeling is, oh my God, this could happen to us. And it doesn't have to be coming from even maybe the party that we would be expecting to do it. It just takes one. Finally, I want to offer this image as another way of understanding what it's like to be in an Israeli's shoes. So this is, as you can guess, a nighttime photograph, a satellite photograph of Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. And the lit up areas are the population centers. Now, inside that red oval is where about 85% of all Israelis live. This is what Israelis think about when they worry about rockets and unconventional weapons, that they worry about a failure and a surprise. And for them, destroying the lives of people inside that oval is the whole ballgame. That's it. It's over. And they understand that. That is something a lot of folks who don't understand the Zionist or Israeli narrative as it relates to the current moment are unaware of. It's a lot to carry that in your heart and on your mind. What else has gotten worse for Israelis during the last 25 years? The visibility and capabilities of extremist Islamist militant groups and governments. I want to be really emphatically clear. There's a big difference between Islamists and Muslims in general. Islamists are members of groups that want to impose a theocratic dictatorship on their own country, and they want to shut down all other interpretations of Islam. And the people that they often hate the most are moderate or liberal Muslims. Their spiritual cousins are the messianic violent extremists among the Jewish settlers of the West Bank, and their spiritual cousins are the most extreme of the, sort of rapture-ready, ultra-conservative Christians who would like to throw out the American Constitution and make the United States a theocracy. And if you ask those people who they fear the most, many of them will say liberal and progressive Christians, because these more moderate and mainstream interpretations of these great religious faith traditions are threatening to the people who have become convinced that God has called them into this extremist vision. And unfortunately, in these times, a powerful country like Iran, a group that has now taken control of southern Yemen, the Houthis, groups that are informed and guided by these particular very modern fundamentalist forms of militant theology. They worry Israelis tremendously because Israelis sit down and say, okay, where do we start? Can they be sidelined or must they be negotiated with? How much power do they have? What do we do? And it's frightening and confusing for Israelis who are interested in reaching some kind of negotiated agreement. All right.
I'm going to ask you to pause for just 1 second so we can open the chat, because you have a few more minutes and that will give people a chance to put in questions as they are arising in the last few minutes.
You're
Okay, the
absolutely,
chat is open.
that's
Thank you.
great. And
I do suggest that you chat directly to me. I can see them and help formulate questions, but I can't force you to do that.
so folks, thank you for that. And I'm looking at my own stopwatch. I see I'm at an hour 12. I'm going to make you a promise that I'm wrapping up by an hour 20 on my stopwatch. So I want to, I just finished going through an Israeli narrative, a Zionist narrative of these last 20 years. And if you think about it and the Palestinian one I did before it, wow, are they different? Wow, are they both intense? And for a lot of people, if you spend time in one or the other, they feel very convincing. And I want to just leave that with you as part of what we all have in front of us to attempt to wrestle with. That leads us to a slide I call So What Now? And I'm asking this actually before October 7th, which is a little bit of a crazy thing to do, although I think that whenever this current war ends, that we'll actually be back to this slide. And this slide presents 7 different scenarios for what the future could look like. Okay, and I'm going to kind of sprint through it. I'm not actually going to spend as much time as I might otherwise with this slide. So the very first one that says endless occupation could also be called, quote unquote, managing the conflict. That is that has basically been the platform that Netanyahu has been able to stay in power for most of the past 15 years upon. This idea that we can just continue with the status quo indefinitely, and at the same time, we can pick off more and more Sunni Arab wealthy states that don't really care so much about the Palestinians and are willing to make pragmatic peace agreements with us. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is to go back to Oslo and try to get across the finish line. Another possibility is that none of these initiatives work, and what ends up happening is a grassroots movement that gains momentum to create a binational state in the land with democracy, equal rights, and freedom of movement for all. This is actually something the vast majority of Israeli Jews don't want. It's actually something that a majority of Palestinians, at least in the West Bank, also don't want. Both groups still prefer some way for each group to have its own state in which it gets to be the majority. But in the absence of other solutions, this is one that may become reality. Then there's confederation and 2 states in one place. These are creative diplomatic initiatives that try to take some of the features of a 2-state agreement, but that also loosen up some of the rigid boundaries of that agreement so that, for example, the settlers don't have to move. And so that, for example, Palestinians who live inside Israel proper could choose to remain there but be citizens of the state of Palestine. The next box is what's called transfer by the super far right members of Netanyahu's government, or ethnic cleansing, if you want to call a spade a spade. These are folks who want to forcibly drive the Palestinians out of the West Bank and Gaza. And then the last one here is an approach that some Palestinian activists are starting to embrace, which is this idea that they basically want to say to the Israelis, you won. You get all the land, now make me a citizen. Once we're all citizens, guess what? There's 7 million Jews and there's approximately 7 million Palestinians. So we'll split the Knesset 50-50, and then we can use a legislative process to decide what to do next. If we want to redivide the land, we can use a nonviolent legislative process. Obviously, most Israelis don't want this. A lot of Palestinian younger activists who are secular, who do not like Hamas and do not like religious coercion of any sort, have found this very appealing because they feel that they can basically take this approach and say, you won, we give up. Now make us citizens. Or else don't make us citizens, but admit then that this is not a democracy. But we're going to keep demanding our civil rights because we think you're in charge. So those are 7 different versions of what the future could look like. And I'm going to close out with just some images of people. And I'm going to, as I scroll through these, read the last words that I have here that I prepared. So as a progressive Zionist, what do I do with this complicated, uneven, and messy package of information about all that we've covered, the founding of Israel, the birth of the Palestinian refugee crisis, and everything that's come since? Well, for me, it leads to the conclusion that Israelis are neither devils nor angels, and the same is true for the Palestinians and their Arab allies. Without whitewashing war crimes committed by Jews, I still believe that historically, the Jewish claim for self-determination and sovereignty in some part of British Mandate Palestine was reasonably legitimate, was understandable, and as a matter of human rights, should be given its due. I cannot quite buy the Palestinian argument that the other nations of the world had no right to weigh in on what should become of this particular land, or that the major religions with longstanding connections to the land also should not have had a voice in those decisions. If the Zionists did wrong, it was in being insufficiently willing to give enough weight to the wishes of the Palestinians. But I'm not convinced that they had no business seeking to have a future in Palestine, or that the other international actors with a stake in Palestine should all have kept out of the business of the population living there at the time. That said, I am deeply convinced that the Palestinian Arab claim to self-determination and sovereignty in Palestine is also legitimate, and that there is no getting around the moral responsibility that Israel bears towards the Palestinian civilians that it dispossessed. All of these claims should be given their due. Compromise with honesty about the past and mutually agreed upon compensation for losses all will form parts of a just solution. For me, personally, learning all of this has not led me to stop thinking of myself as a Zionist, which I define as someone who supports the existence of a democratic Israel that functions as a global refuge for the Jewish people in some portion of this land. But it has had some big impacts on me. One is that I accept living with a greater measure of self-doubt than I used to have about the justice of Israel's founding. I also reject the claim that anti-Zionism is automatically anti-Semitism. To paraphrase the late Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, Jews should not expect Palestinians to become liberal Zionists. It makes sense to me that Palestinians and their closest supporters don't believe that Zionism has been justified, and that their narrative of the conflict is centered on their collective consciousness and experience, not ours. Unfortunately, today, more and more pro-Israel advocates claim that if someone is an anti-Zionist, then they are anti-Semitic. I have come to the place where I believe that some anti-Zionist expressions include anti-Semitism, but that in and of itself, a person can conclude that a different political arrangement would be better than one that includes an expressly Jewish state without being an anti-Jewish racist. Studying all of this has made me far more sympathetic to the human plight of Palestinians, but Perhaps unexpectedly, it has also made me more sympathetic to the Jews who came to Palestine in the first half of the 20th century and to the first generation of Israelis. I have come to see both groups as neither the devils nor the angels that they are portrayed as in the other's narrative. And my heart sinks every time I'm in the presence of any public speaker or presentation that offers a two-dimensional caricature of the conflict and lacks any semblance of empathy or self-doubt. From studying this conflict, I have learned that empathy and healthy self-doubt are unbelievably valuable and absolutely necessary parts of our humanity. And I've come to believe that we will not get the biggest things right in this world. We will not get religious hatred, climate collapse, racism, or massive wealth inequality right as human beings until we've come to integrate empathy and healthy self-doubt into our communities and cultures. So thanks for all this good listening and sharing. And I went slightly over 120 on my stopwatch, but not too bad. And I'm really interested in responding as best I can to curated versions of questions that may have come across the transom.
So Rabbi Harris, first, thank you for what has been a month long and 4 magnificent sessions that really help all of us see the conflict in much greater perspective and understanding. So we thank you all for all of that. I want to toss you what seemed to me a very softball question when I read it, and then I thought, at the end of the day, it is the most critical one. Professor Susan Prager asked us, not a relative, just happened to have the same last name, but she asked a beautiful question. She said, after all the things that you've said today and in the preceding weeks, is peace even possible in your view? Big question.
Yeah. You know, I want to be the person who says, of course, peace is possible and has an eloquent response. I mean, yes, peace is possible. Um, and but peace is not automatic. It may or may not come to be, but I do believe it's possible. And I think that's the case because of other examples of some of the most brutal and horrific cruelty that nations have inflicted upon each other. And they're no longer at war, and now they have open borders and peace. I mean, you can drive from France through the Netherlands into Germany without even stopping. And that would be unthinkable to people not so very long ago. Um, you know, our 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 country was really um, brutally and frightfully attacked by Japan's army, and they were run by people who were like racial supremacists. Um, and and then we in turn dropped atomic weapons on 2 of their cities. Um, and we kind of love each other now. You know, I think peace is possible. I also think peace sometimes happens unpredictably. Um, I think that it's also possible that we'll find a way to have periods of peace and then slip back into periods of violence. Um, I, I, I just don't know. But as a rabbi, I can say that, you know, we're guided by the mitzvah to seek peace and pursue it. We're guided by core beliefs that every human being is created in the divine image. We're guided by the advice of Hillel If we cannot be for ourselves, if we cannot stand up for our own group safety and basic rights, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Like we have a duty, a moral obligation to stand up for ourselves as a people. And if we are only for ourselves, what are we? Like the point of Judaism is not build a fortress, keep it safe, and morality goes out the window. It doesn't matter if you build the fortress and keep it safe. We're supposed to be better than that. Right? So I mean we have guiding principles that are shaped by many centuries of religious wisdom and that are actually um, deep and wise and try to address both our self-interest and our higher purpose. And I trust that there can be a way to a better future and a better reality. Do I know what the odds are of getting there, or what it will take to finally get there? I don't, but I hope.
Thank you. That seemed to be both the simplest and most important question. Um, Someone asked, and I thought it was a very interesting question. What does the Palestinian Authority want? What is their position on a two-state solution?
Um, Oops, that's a really good question. So the Palestinian Authority is so broken and discredited right now that uh, it's really tough. Um, and they partly did it to themselves um, by maintaining um, a culture of rampant corruption that surrounded Yasser Arafat and his cohort. And by corruption, I mean like basically financial corruption. Um, so, they partly did it to themselves, and the 15 years plus of Netanyahu policy that expressly sought to weaken and dismantle the possibility of the Palestinian Authority being functional has also played a role. And a lot of Israelis right now are talking about how an unspoken but real part of that policy included kind of making space for Hamas to be viable, to be politically viable as a counterweight to the PA. And a lot of Israelis who previously supported Netanyahu now are openly calling for his resignation for that reason alone. Um, what do they want? Um, you're talking about by they, you're talking about the members of Abbas's cabinet as well as the members of the political parties that form the majority of the Palestinian Legislative Council. Um, Asking what they want is a little bit like asking what the Knesset wants. Um, what I can tell you is that one thing Mahmoud Abbas has been consistent about, and he's someone I fault about a great many things, but one thing he's been very consistent about, and that his top ministers have been very consistent about, is stating that they will abide by all agreements that they have entered into, and that they expect the government of Israel to do the same. That's one tune that they haven't really ever changed. And that's what matters. So, in terms of the agreements they've already made agreements that recognize the state of Israel as a permanent member of the United Nations, as a permanent member state. Um, and they've made agreements, calling for uh, a negotiated process on those five final status issues. And those five final status issues include the final borders of a two-state solution. And the disagreements, the space in between the two parties is, it's about whether the boundaries of the West Bank and Gaza are precisely the final boundaries or whether there are a few small squiggles that allow the Israelis to keep a big chunk of their settlements that are close to Jerusalem and that give the Palestinians some territory, probably in the Negev, that is almost entirely depopulated. So I think what matters is what kind of an agreement is possible with the one internationally recognized government, of the Palestinians, and what kinds of partners throughout the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia and other important players in the Sunni Arab world, are willing to put their country's signatures on the line as part of a regional agreement, that also explicitly recognizes Israel as a permanent member state of the United Nations. And some there is a path towards a viable political agreement of some sort that takes roughly the shape I've been describing, and then it's risk. Will that agreement hold? Will it be better or worse than it was before for the Israelis, for the Palestinians? Unclear. Um, it's there's no getting rid of the risk, but there is the ability to notice when what you're doing right now isn't working, or when what you've been doing for the last 15 years hasn't worked out the way you'd hoped. And that much feels clear. Um, so uh, that's my best shot at answering that question.
Not an easy question. Uh, we have the same question from two people, so I'm going to throw it out there. You gave us several different models that might be avenues toward a peace solution. One was questioned by both Talia and Tanda. On a practical level, wouldn't the seventh option be akin to a one-state solution? Is there a distinction between those two models? Perhaps you can
Yes.
throw up that slide again so we can see the different models.
Yeah, sure thing. And it's a really good question, and it makes total sense. And actually, there is one distinction, for why the two things aren't the same idea, or aren't perceived as the same idea. We're going back through all these lovely faces. One of the things I thought about doing with all these pictures was not indicating who was Palestinian and who was Jewish, because they're both multiracial groups and you can't really tell just by looking. Um, okay, so this is the slide we're talking about. So um, the difference with the civil rights first idea, the one where the one that's really being led by younger Palestinian secular activists, um, is that what they envision, is that they would, um, look for ways to engage Gandhi style, mass nonviolent disruption, um, demanding, equal rights and demanding that they be made Israeli citizens. Um, so, first of all, that sounds really different and feels really different for Palestinians, who might actually be, rooting for the what I've uh, slightly tongue-in-cheek called Israelstein option, which is the binational single state. So those the folks who have gravitated towards advocating for that in the Palestinian community don't want to be Israeli citizens. That thought is very disturbing to them. The folks saying, let's just go for civil rights first, are saying, we surrender. We surrender. You won. And we no longer recognize the Palestinian Authority. There's just Israel here. That's all there is here. And then what they're talking about is, like chaining themselves to the front of every office building, or just engaging in all kinds of disruptive nonviolence with a media strategy to shine a light on people, basically saying, make me an Israeli. I live under your rule. Give me the vote. Now, what they're saying is, um, part of what they're basically doing is they're saying, let's use a strategy that calls the Israelis bluff. Um, you want it all, you got it all, or do you really want it? So that's part of what this strategy is about. But another part of it is, what they're saying is, okay, so then let's say you say, you know what, you guys are right. We did win. We are ruling you. And the truth is, you should be Israeli citizens. We already have a model for this. 20% of the population living inside Israel proper are Arab and Druze and a small number of other religious and ethnic groups. And um, you are now the newest Israelis. And what this group is then imagining is that there would be elections, and then you'd have a 50-50 Knesset, uh, based on religious and ethnic lines, probably with a couple dozen parties reflecting divisions within those two groups. And then what they're saying is that Knesset might then choose by ballot to split itself into two states or not. They're basically saying, we don't care. Whatever the collective of all us Israelis decides to do together after we all have equal rights under one government is up to the people. We are not stating a preference, right? So that's different than the folks who are really saying, no, I'm for a binational state. I believe in the future of this place, that we can do it, we can succeed as a binational, secular, democratic state. And let me explain all the reasons why that is the future model that I'm advocating. So that's my best shot at explaining the difference.
Very interesting. Uh, and I appreciated seeing many different models besides the two-state solution, which had been in vogue for a long time, but it's interesting to see that there are other options. One questioner asked, noting that there is a certain public cachet to the label of an apartheid state that has its roots perhaps in the two different legal systems that apply to settlers and Palestinians in the West Bank. He asks, are there points that help refute the apartheid label allegation? I thought it was a fair question.
Sure it is. No, it absolutely is. So this is one of those words that people mean different things by it when they use it. So a lot of the times what happens is that people get into bitter arguments with each other, and they're actually using the word in totally different ways. So there's three ways, in my opinion, that people use the word apartheid when they're talking about Israel. One is they're talking about what is apartheid as a crime in international law, and they're raising the question of whether or not Israel's government is guilty of committing that crime. The second is the way that people use it is they're referring to historical apartheid in South Africa, and they're saying, look at the similarities. The third way that people sometimes use it is less precise than either of those, and it's just, this is my way of saying Israel is the stinkiest country in the world. Okay, so there's those are the three ways I think people use the word. So the first way, it's really important to understand in international law, there is no such thing as an apartheid state. That doesn't exist. There is the crime of apartheid. And this is based on a set of laws that became part of that, like UN approved international law that defined the crime of apartheid. And the crime of apartheid is actually quite different than what happened in South Africa historically. The crime of apartheid involves, I actually have something about this. Let me just see if I have it handy. It involves any government that does three things is guilty of the crime. Actually, I have a slide. I will share it. Okay, there it is. I'm gonna go to this slide. Sorry, I thought I was going to a different slide, but here we go. Okay, the legal definition of apartheid: a government that operates a system of oppression and domination by one group over one or more other groups. In which, okay, so you're operating a system of oppression, you're a government, you're operating a system of oppression in which one group is dominating one or other groups, in which your government commits inhumane acts, and then there's a list of what these are, and your government intends to maintain this indefinitely. So the thing about the crime of apartheid is that a lot of countries are guilty right now of committing the crime of apartheid. And it turns out that human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have been busy accusing a whole bunch of countries of being guilty of this crime, including a lot of Muslim countries. And I say that because Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have now also issued reports saying that they believe that the government of Israel is guilty of committing this crime. What I'm trying to tell you is that in international law, the bar for committing the crime of apartheid is a lot lower than what happened in South Africa historically. And you can see, for example, what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghurs absolutely meets the criteria. What happened to the Tibetans meets the criteria. This is a chart that actually lists a whole bunch of countries, including the United States, that concludes that all of these countries are currently guilty of committing the crime of apartheid. So what does that mean? It means we have a lot of confusion, right? So I'm not trying to minimize the crime as it sits in international law. I think it's important to understand it. And honestly, I am not an international lawyer. If Israel was brought before the court and asked to determine one way or the other, it wouldn't surprise me if the court said yes, but it also wouldn't surprise me if the court said yes about 24 other countries. So there's a lot of apartheid going on. When you get to the issue of in what ways is what's going on in Israel like or not like what was going on in South Africa, for me, it's really, really clear that inside Israel proper, there's no comparison, and it's just false to say that what's going on inside Israel proper, among Israeli citizens, 20% of whom are Arab Israelis, that is not apartheid. That is a democratic society that has a problem with majority bigotry towards the minority population, which means that it's a democratic society like most other democratic societies that has work to do on prejudice and racism and issues that fail to make it live up to its own ideals in terms of its own citizens. If you ask me, is what's going on in the West Bank looking creepily like what went on in South Africa? I'm going to tell you, I think it kind of does. I think it kind of does. Where does that leave someone like me as a progressive Zionist when I hear public speakers saying Israel and apartheid in the same sentence? I am determined to find out the whole context. And if it's coming from a whole larger package of content that is also just adamantly totally opposed to Zionism, then I'm skeptical, and I'm probably starting to get my hackles up and I'm about ready to argue. If, however, it's coming from Israeli human rights organizations demanding that their government stop what it's doing in the West Bank, my reaction tends to be, you go, you push your government to change this up, because this doesn't look right to me. And that's kind of where I land with it. I absolutely recognize that there is this third category. Okay, I don't think Israel is the crummiest country in the planet, not by a long shot, not by a long shot. And so when I feel like that's how the word is being used, I get my back up.
I think that's very helpful. Thank you. I'm going to ask what I hope is the last or next to last question, and so that we can wrap up in just about 5 minutes. And this one is one that has been gnawing at me for a long time. The settler movement has exploded, and it is not just people who are settling in the West Bank, but people of a particular ideological stripe that some may describe as ultra-religious, but it is more like messianic, and includes this sort of Judeo-supremacism that says, only Jews are allowed here, or should be here, or should settle here. And that's a very frightening development. And it has now reached hundreds of thousands of people, and also seats in the Knesset. So it represents a voting bloc. And my question is, does that voting bloc, and does that accumulation of ideology make the prospect of a two-state solution, or any solution, much more difficult or impossible?
For sure, it does. And so I've spent a bunch of time recently researching Islamist, extremist, fundamentalist groups and their ideologies, in part because I'm so freaked out by them and wanted to understand what was going on. And I've also spent a fair amount of time learning about this particular strand of sort of Jewish messianist nationalist fervor. And something that these movements have in common with each other, the Islamist ones and the Jewish ones, is they have several features that fundamentalist movements, modern fundamentalist movements, tend to have. And someone who does a beautiful job of describing this, by the way, is the popular writer Karen Armstrong. And what she observes, and I definitely saw this so plainly, learning more about groups like Hamas and the Houthis and the Messianist settlers. They're reactionary, right? They want to go back to a time of greater purity, and they want to purify their own nation. The folks they hate the most are the liberal versions of their own religious tradition. Those are the people who are ruining everything. They're bringing down God's anger on the group, and they, engage in a fantasy that through their leadership, they will lead their people backwards in time to a glorious time of purification, a purified version of the faith. Um, what is ironic, and this is what Karen Armstrong points out, is that um, none of these groups' interpretations of their religious traditions would be possible before the modern era. They read their sacred texts in a way that nobody before the modern era ever read a sacred text. They use Western methods of journalistic, factual, analytical interpretation to hyperliterally read their sacred texts. Nobody read texts that way in the Renaissance time, in the Muslim Golden Age, in pre-modern times. It's a transporting of a modern mode of reading from one arena to to sacred texts. And the other thing that they do is they readily absorb far-flung conspiracy ideas about their enemies, and a lot of those ideas only came to originate in the 20th century. So for the Muslim groups, they bizarrely swirl in all these strands that came from the protocols of the Elders of Zion, or from the Nazis, or from the Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda mill, which was its own bizarro thing that conflated Zionism and Judaism into like a big international conspiracy whose purpose was to destroy the Soviet Union. So they grab these strands and they weave them into this hyperliteral fundamentalist reading, and they create something that starts out fringy and new, and that reacts to fear and distress and, in some cases, oppression that's coming down on their home community. And in the case of the Messianist settlers, they have grabbed onto, very semi-consciously grabbed onto and integrated a whole lot of different conspiratorial theories or pseudoscientific racial theories to explain how the Jewish soul is actually greater than the non-Jewish soul, to explain how there's a link between between Jewish DNA. Some of them actually preach this stuff, which is why they're so hyper threatened by intermarriage, by the way. And they would probably hit the roof for someone pointing out that some of this way of thinking came from the Nazis, but it did. So again, it's this toxic blend of ideas. And then you asked, so do they win? Do they get to stop? Will they succeed in preventing any kind of negotiated peace agreement, especially if it involves territorial compromise? I have no clue if they'll win or not. I know that they don't represent anything close to the majority of Israelis. And I also know that a lot of secular Israelis now are really angry at them because they recognize that the lives that these folks want to change are the lives of other Jewish Israelis as much as anybody else's lives. And the vast majority of Israelis don't want that. So I hope, and I think it's probably true, that the majority of Iranians don't actually want to live under no choice religious totalitarian system, but we can't know because they can't say. And same thing for Palestinians, like especially those living in Gaza. There's like stuff about, oh, they polled them and they're approving. What are they going to say? They don't even know who's on the other end of the phone or who's listening. Of course they're approving. Like, I just think it's hard to know. Do these extremist movements win in the end? Or do they eventually get bypassed? I've come to not believe it's possible to just defeat them and then have them be finished. It seems like whatever set of circumstances led to their arising in the first place will continue to exist, and there's a decent chance that some new version of them will come into being. So that leads me to think that some other kind of process is needed to defeat them. And I think that that may have to do with figuring out how to build very strong coalitions that cross a lot of different lines and that then are able to insist and demand, a different kind of society that does not allow these groups to even think they have a chance of being in charge. But it's scary, and it's very hard to know. I'll say one last thing. There are people who have argued that one of the reasons that Oslo hasn't succeeded was a failure by the PLO, which was run by secular people, and by the government of Rabin, that both of those right from the get-go should have co-opted and brought on board key religious leaders who were deeply respected by the traditionalists in their respective communities. Now, maybe that's easier to say than to do. But the point that these critics make is that they should have put everything they had into trying to get that to happen. That if they could have gotten some bigwigs in both of these respective religious communities to endorse this, instead of thinking of them right from the beginning as these guys are going to be the problem, and getting into an oppositional posture towards them, which is what they did. They just hoped they could move faster and smarter. And so I don't know if maybe there's a future opportunity, to find other folks who are figures in the Orthodox world or in the Muslim religious world who, who have some credibility with the traditionalists in their community and who can, come forward to play a role in some kind of compromise and stop making compromise be a dirty word in the religious imagination.
Thank you. I think we've drawn to a close. I have a few things to say. One is just on that last point, the million Jews who rallied only 3 or 4 months ago in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv for a more just and democratic Israel may be the real refutation of the settler movement. But putting that aside, 2 things I want to say. One quick plug. This has been a wonderful event. It's brought to you by West End Synagogue. West End Synagogue is a vibrant, progressive, intellectual, and spiritual Jewish community on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And those who are visiting, we would love to have you again. Come to our synagogue or zoom into our events. We have a vibrant adult education committee. There are many events that you might want to see, as well as an opportunity to be part of a really terrific community. But further than that, I just want to thank you, Rabbi Harris. This has been a truly extraordinary experience. It's really broadened our minds and allowed us to see this issue from many perspectives. We even have planned for tomorrow a follow-up discussion for our own synagogue. But we really have to thank you for what has been an extraordinary effort on your part. And I'm going to ask if our host can unmute us all for a moment. Can you do that? Because I really want to give you a standing ovation and for this marvelous.
I cannot unmute. Everybody has to unmute themselves.
Well, then
Thank
please
you.
unmute
Thank you
yourselves.
so very much.
And I would like
Thank
just
you,
like us
Rabbi
all to
Maurice.
clap.
Thank you,
Okay.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
So much. It was really
Oh, thank you so much.
It was
Well done.
wonderful.
It was terrific.
Rabbi.
So appreciate it. Look forward to the slides too.
Enlightening, just enlightening, wonderful.
and so credible.
Gratitude.
Okay.
Much gratitude.
Thank you all. Well done.
להתראות.
Leila Tov, Chavrei.
What's next for you, Rabbi? Are you going to do any more of these? That's what I want to know.
Oh, he signed off?
He may have signed off.
Are there going to be any more,
I think he
guys?
may have jumped off. I don't see him suddenly. So I think perhaps he
can
was
you tell us?
overcome. Anyway, it's wonderful to
He's
see
a
all
very
of you
humble
here tonight.
person. He probably felt embarrassed by all this adoration.
I really
Thank you for
think
the
it was a
organizers,
terrific
too.
event.
Yes, thank
Indeed.
you.